Good morning and welcome to our party. My name is Pam Schaefer and I'm on the Friends Board, the Friends of the Library Board. And I'm so excited that you all could be here today to join in the celebration with us of the library's past, its present, and its future. We are so fortunate to have in our community David Munford, who's going to give us a little talk about where the library has been. Because while this building is 100 years old, the library has existed in Middlebury as part of the community for much longer than that. So as a Middlebury resident, a historian, and an author of the book about Middlebury, Images of Becoming America series on Middlebury, David has a good perspective about our community. So thank you for all coming, and I'm going to turn it over to David. Please help us.
Well, I thought I'd give you my little spiel here, and then afterwards, please feel free to ask any sorts of questions as obscure as possible, because the Colonel has been looking down on me ever since I was old enough to read, and I'm just happy to try to give him a little credit here. Certainly an interesting and sometimes tragic figure, but anyway, we'll get to that. So, in 1794, the town of Middlebury retained much of its original rough and tumble frontier character, complete with a plentiful selection of both sawmills and taverns. Both the college and the town's first church were still in the future. A quiet demand for civilization did exist, however, and such citizens who yearned for divine services and the library had to make do with rooms somewhere in Mattock's Tavern. This important structure stood on the high ground, first spotted and then purchased by Gamaliel Painter. Our town father envisioned and intended Middlebury as a shire town. So this initial attempt was named the Center Library. The records show 34 members until it closed in 1805. There's a gap in the narrative until 1848, when the Middlebury Reading Association, also known as the Lyceum, was founded. Since they subscribed to most available periodicals, we can assume the readership was aware of international news. This would include revolutions in Europe, following the publication of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. Historians refer to 1848 as, quote, the turning point at which history refused to turn. The American Civil War ended in 1865. In that same year, in Brooklyn, New York, Colonel Silas Ilsley and his wife Mary celebrated the birth of their first child, Osborne Augustine Ilsley. In 1868, 60 women of Middlebury each paid the sum of $2 in dues to form the Ladies' Library Association. In 1867, men were admitted. I thought that was a nice touch. Emma Willard is out there somewhere. By 1868, the collection could claim 345 volumes. In 1869, the Ilsley family, still in Brooklyn, added their second son, Edwin Stetson Ilsley. By 1870, the library was housed in the Battel block, and directions explained it was on the second floor, around and back. The Battel block was destroyed in one of downtown's devastating fires, and the library found itself a new, if temporary, home in the Beckwith block. This handsome building survived the fire of 1881 and still stands as a monument to one of Middlebury's homegrown talents, the architect Clinton Smith. In 1885, the library suffered a brief decline in membership. The alleged reason, I suspect, was recorded from a male point of view. It explained, "Women have spent so much time reading periodicals, they have no time for books." The Wandering Collection was housed one more time in 1887 upstairs in what is now the Hubbard Agency, just south of the Middlebury Inn, known at the time as the Addison House. In 1898, the poor librarian pleaded with the town for some payment for her services. She was politely informed that it was not going to happen. She quit. In the meantime, Silas and Mary Ilsley had quietly moved from Brooklyn to Middlebury, where for the next 20 years they stayed in a suite of rooms at the Addison House. One of their sons had died in 1875, followed by his older brother 5 years later. Here, I think it worthwhile to make a comparison with Calvin Coolidge. The man could never be accused of being loquacious, but it was only after the premature death of his son that he turned into Silent Cal. Colonel Ilsley, likewise, had very little to say. He expressed himself through his philanthropic actions. By the time he adopted Middlebury, Colonel Ilsley had made his fortune in tin. Original ceilings in Merchant's Row testified to the popularity of stamped tin as a decorative building material. In 1904, the Colonel provided funding for the Middlebury County Fairgrounds, and a year later, the Baptist Church. The church is constructed of granite by the same carvers from Barry, who then went on to craft the town's war memorial. When asked to speak at its dedication ceremony, Colonel Ilsley stood up and said, "It gives me great pleasure to dedicate this memorial to the people and soldiers of Middlebury." Then he sat down. My comment there is it made the Gettysburg Address sound wordy. Colonel Silas Ilsley had fellow combat veterans in his audience. They shared a type of knowledge impossible to translate. It had absolutely nothing to do with glory. The century had turned and optimism was in the air. In 1911, the town was proud to show off its brand new brick high school, now a marker in the park to our east. The library went public as the Town and Ladies Library Association, and to celebrate, hired a librarian, Miss Carrie Damon, at 20 cents an hour. When Colonel Silas Ilsley died, his will, circa 1919, left a generous sum for his groom. Much like his contemporary, Joseph Battel, Silas Ilsley dearly loved his Morgan horses. Funds were also bequeathed to the college and the library. In 1920, Miss Damon was officially appointed town librarian. All she needed was a library. That same year, Mary Osborne Ilsley died, and with her will, the money was finally available. With $25,000 from each of the Illsleys in 1924, this building became a reality. There were the sorts of incidents we might expect, of course. It is recorded that in 1930, Miss Damon had some difficulties with rowdy high school students. In 1939, there was controversy about the purchase of the Grapes of Wrath as being, quote, potentially socially disruptive. In 1956, Carrie Damon retired, leaving her protege, Ellen Brown, in charge as head librarian. By this point in time, I was already a patron. The circulation desk was a massive red oak beast, and the two librarians stood behind it, looking every bit the custodians of literacy they were. Behind them, Colonel Ilsley's sword was displayed, hanging on the wall. The atmosphere was solemn. Silence was the rule. books were loaned out on a personal basis. A standing carousel in the lobby held laminated copies of the Declaration of Independence, plus portraits of the presidents. In 1961, I somehow missed the dust-up over John Updike's new novel, Rabbit Run. It was finally made available, but strictly at the discretion of the librarian. In 1966, the Friends of the Library were organized by Dr. Stephen Freeman, also its first president. A little local color here. When I was growing up on South Street, I had two World War I fighter pilots as neighbors. One was Dr. Freeman and the other his colleague, Professor Waldo Heinrichs. 1972, the Ladies Library Association officially handed over their ownership of the collection to the town. In 1975, my friend Angie Martin took over and saw to it an elevator was installed. We can also thank her for the children's room. In 1988, the North Side edition was completed. In 1997, another old friend, Dick Sodal, launched the library website. In 2003, the side entrance was expanded. Two more friends of mine were in charge, so I stopped by the job to see how things were going. Abundant yellow tape had the work area well cordoned off. Several big signs politely directed library patrons to please use the front entrance. One of my pals was standing shoulder deep in a hole just inside the doorway. While I was chatting with him, frantic efforts were underway to get past us and inside. Mothers were desperately attempting to toss their toddlers across the void. It was really something. It all worked out somehow and nobody got hurt. I'd like to bring us more or less up to date. I want to say hooray for Dolly Parton, who set up a foundation in 2007 to mail a free book once a month to children under 5. Along with the wonderful new library, this gives me hope for the future. Thank you. I can't help but be reminded, I didn't want to integrate it, but I could do it now as an addendum here. 1972, the Ladies Library Association officially handed over their ownership of the collection to the town. I can't help but think about the Music Man. Remember that wonderful lyric? She left River City, the library building, but she left all the books to her. Right? Beautiful, right? Life imitating art or art imitating life, I'm not sure which. And that is true about the side entrance. I mean, it was surreal. People were trying, maybe if you just went around to the phone. It was either funny or frightening, I'm not sure which. And then the other, and I do remember Miss Damon, and that desk was, I swear, it was at least twice as tall. So some people, military people remember. And I asked, there are two artifacts that I cannot, wait a minute, I take that back. Apparently, we do know where the former desk went to. It's out there someplace. And it's a big, you had to sign, your library cards and so forth. The big mystery involves the Colonel's sword. And Judy Holler has been looking for it for years. And Angie Martin, I should have asked her, but she's no longer with us, and I never found out. But it did hang over there, and Judy is convinced that when we start tearing the place apart, it will show up inside one of the walls. Yeah, I mean, it's like this wonderful mystery. And then the question about whether or not, I did throw in that comment about, I avoided bringing in Joe Battel because there's a whole, rabbit hole in itself. But at one point in military history, there were essentially two dueling philanthropists. And one of them was Colonel Ilsley, and the other was Joe Battel. And Joe Battel, in sort of a local Vermont tradition of honorary title, was referred to as Colonel. Now, mind you, he bought his, surrogate to go to the Civil War. And so in his mind, he and Ilsley were in some sort of dreadful competition. I don't think the colonel ever saw it that way, or if it did, he didn't bother him. It just was, not his thing. But if you look at the timeline of endowments, it gets pretty funny, because I think it was immediately after the War Memorial that Joe Battel put in the fountain that was absolutely enormous at that point. I mean, this is like 1/3 the size of the original, had an eagle on top and everything else. And if you follow again, every time the colonel would, by 1924, both of them had gone on. But at any rate, it was just funny that Battel would always, and also the other thing about, as I discovered in my research, Battel is you couldn't shut the man up. I mean, on paper or anything else, he just had endless, the most amazing. I can't say that I recommend reading Ellen. It is extraordinary. It's somewhere between druidic and I don't know. It's just impossible to. Well, it's almost impossible to read for a start. At some point, I've set out to write a concordance. And it is. I think the only thing you can say about Ellen is that it's inadvertently hilarious. But the colonel, good Lord, we turned the town upside down trying to find something, and the only thing available really was his will. And that was pretty brief and to the point. In other words, his speech at the dedication was very much his style. He didn't have a whole lot to say. And then, the other thing is, I don't know if you, I'm always amazed at what little tidbits of history or around Middlebury that I myself didn't know about until I started doing further research. But if you ever find yourself on the Upper Town Green, there's the honor roll of names. And on that list, I think there were a fair number of Civil War veterans. And so here was Colonel Ilsley. So the question, I backtracked it to see if he had in fact seen combat with his Brooklyn regiments. Thank you. It was not at Vermont. But the answer is yes. It was toward the end of the war, and he was at Appomattox. But his regiment got pretty chewed up in the week before that. So I think it's, again, some of this is just intuition or inference or what have you. But the expression at that point was, and what a wonderful term, sort of 19th century. If you had seen combat, you had seen the elephant. And I know I've had various friends who were in combat and various wars, and the town really had when I was growing up, the town was packed full of World War II veterans, and the vast majority of them, as we all know, didn't want to talk about it, and that was fine. I think the colonel probably fell into that category, and what tipped me off was that very, very, very short dedication speech. Because what was he going to say? I mean, there was also, if you're interested, in the West Cemetery, which is a tremendous gold mine in itself, the Middlebury's Congressional Medal of Honor winner from Cedar Creek is there, Amasa Tracy. And I've known some people with PTSD, and I look at the portraits of Amasa Tracy in full uniform, and he's just, oof. He's seen things that he was wounded some ridiculous number of times. But when he came back to Middlebury, he started the general store, and it was known that you didn't talk about his war history. So again, back to Colonel Ilsley, and here are these at least 20 men in the audience who had seen the elephant, and he was no one to beat the drum and talk about how glorious everything was. I didn't know until fairly recently that he'd even had children, because I think he just sort of, as tragedy will sometimes do, that made him even less willing to talk about such things. He did, if you have a chance to see, in the town hall, there's a marvelous photograph of the fairgrounds and the racetrack, and it was his money that created the biggest grandstand in the state, And he, as I said, he left his groom a pretty substantial chunk of money. And you know, one of the transitions that he saw, and Joe Battel, was Middlebury going from horses to automobiles. And Joe Battel, and I you know, he in some ways he can be silly, but in other ways he was absolutely dead on, because he in his he published the local newspaper, the Register, and it's pretty interesting stuff. But he, every time he could find an incident of some fatal automobile accident, boy, he would just whoop. And he said, and he was right, unfortunately, that the automobile was going to be the end of us. You know, it was going to ruin everything. Now the Colonel, again, he had a stable, he had beautiful horses, but he sort of focused his attention. And so interesting, you know, geographically, Battel, you know, the Morgan Horse Farm, and then the Colonel had his stable near the Addison House Middlebury Inn, so he could have easy access to the fairgrounds.
So the fairgrounds and the racetrack which you described are now the recreational fields by Mary Hogan.
Exactly. When I was going to Mary Hogan as a kid, you could actually see some of the remnants of the old fairgrounds. Yeah, that's right. And then it converted. I can't remember. It was pretty much over with by the early 50s, but at one point it did make a sort of Devil's Bowl transition from horses to cars. And all I can hope is that Joe Battel was in his grave at that point, at which point he'd be turning over at a high rate of speed. But yeah, then again, everything why, and this is the question I try to anticipate, or I try to answer the question myself. What drew Silas Ilsley to Middlebury? And the only thing I could come up with was this pretty thin tracking here. I went up to the Vermont room like 3 or 4 different times, turning it inside out, and there's got to be something here somewhere. And the best I could do was his signature in a history of the Baptist Church. And then I went into it in more detail, and apparently Silas Ilsley's father, who, however these things are arranged, was sent from Brooklyn to be a pastor in, I think, Whiting or Bridport, and that's how Silas knew about Middlebury, as far as I can tell. By the way, if anybody comes up with any tidbits about the Colonel, I'm more than grateful to, you know, because I really found him a very fascinating character, but again, really tough to get a handle on in terms of any speeches, written, anything. He just didn't do that. And back to Joe Battel for a second. He another little tiny bit of town history here. I can't imagine the Colonel getting involved with this one, but across the street over here was it was called the China Hall, right before you went down into Frog Hollow. And I figured out finally that it was, lo and behold, the man who ran it was sort of a general store, but he specialized in China. Okay, fine. And then I found out his last name, which was Wales, and I happen to be friends with the Wales family of Weybridge. And I asked the patriarch, who is still with us, Roger Wales. I said, Roger, how long have the Wales been in Weybridge? And of course, ever since the Indians left. Okay, great. So then I said, okay, fine. So I was out there talking to a couple of his sons, and they ended up digging around in the attic, and they brought down this beautiful, beautiful wooden box like this, and they opened it up, and inside was a brass telescope, really nice one. And I thought, wait a minute, and something clicked, and I realized, oh yeah, the first publication of Joe Battel was, he took a year the Grand Tour, and he took his telescope, and he wrote quite a detailed explanation of the bathing habits of the women of Italy. Well, it must have been something, but there are no copies available. Thank you. His sister found every single copy and burned it. Right? So okay, here so the historian is often left with guesswork. So I thought, wait a minute here, Wales telescope. Aha! Then I thought to myself, yes, that Joe Battel he talked about it apparently. He had a telescope. He wasn't very shy about it for a Victorian. And when the Battel block in its original form had a marvelous cupola, and that was Joe Battel's private apartment. Also, if you take a look at the layout of the town of Middlebury, there's a direct shot across to the women's campus right over the top of the town. Okay, well, I'm not going to carry on with that. You can sort of get the picture. But finding that, the Wales telescope suddenly it all clicked. I said, oh yeah, and then certainly, well, anyway, I guess it was harmless enough. But so there's what I've been able to come up with about Colonel Ilsley. And once again, if anybody, ask Dana, maybe the sword will appear.
We'll keep our eyes open. We'll
Okay.
look for it.
I just remember it. As kids, of course, we were absolutely fascinated by it, and it was the scabbard was kind of tattered and so forth, but the sword looked very, it was just a ceremonial sword, but still, we felt a certain connection with the colonel. And then, I remember, and I'm so happy to find out that poor Carrie Damon actually, was. I hope she got an increase in pay from 20 cents an hour. But the first librarian, whoever she was, this poor anonymous person in this floating collection of books, and she said, "Can I please get paid?" So Carrie Damon was, and that dates me, of course, but that she and Helen Brown, were as you tiptoed in the door, and you could hear all this light. It was quite cavernous. It was the old-fashioned library. This was the periodical section, I remember. And we tiptoed around. We were pretty quiet. And then I kicking myself that I never asked Angie about the sword, because actually, who knows? Maybe she didn't know that. So, anybody have any questions about? No. I was trying to think if there's anything else I could toss in.
Tell us more about the layout of the library in your youth. You said this was
Sure.
the periodicals. What was in other?
Well, the library stopped there. That all of that was just not there. This was the library. There was an upstairs, but no elevator, nothing like that. It was really pretty small. But and now the cloakroom was over here where the coffee is, I guess. And then the carousel was over there. And I don't know if anybody ever looked at it or not, but it was all there, in case you wanted to refresh yourself on the Declaration or various presidents. But I've been a pretty steady patron of the place for many years, and it's it's funny to me because two of my mentors. It's great fun for me to go up and before I started today, I went upstairs and pulled out a couple of Storrs Lee's books on Middlebury. He was a friend of mine. He was a great guy. He was just wonderful. He was terrific with me. He always treated me like an equal and was very generous. And he had a place over in Maine after he had a little dust up with the college. He went over there and had a wonderful place at Pemmican Point. So the Storrs, and the thing is, and all these people in Middlebury when I was growing up that wow, amazing stories and achievements. It wasn't until much later that I realized that Storrs was actually a very prolific author. I strongly recommend his biography of Gamaliel Painter. It's excellent. And there are a bunch of other books in the collection. And Storrs is really a marvelous writer. So I went up and asked his blessing a few minutes ago. The other friend of mine, Arthur Healy, whose painting is up there. And Arthur was a great buddy of mine. We did all sorts of things together. And Arthur was the one who was my history mentor, among other things. And he said something along the lines of, what did you say about the Shelburne Museum? That's right. He said, yes, he said, the Shelburne Museum, that's the way it should have been. And he would, was sort of iconoclastic, you would say. But he told me, never ever believe the official version of anything. Just don't. You can assume that it's probably been been gussied up for, public consumption or the legacy or whatever. But always to try to dig and cross-reference. So I took his advice when I was teaching. My number one mantra was always cross-reference. Always cross-reference. At least 2 sources, preferably 3. And I'm happy to say that totally through accident, I'm sure, but and my wife's a Latin teacher, so one of our proteges, I'm happy to say, last summer, we were in Oxford so that we could see him get his PhD. Not bad from a boy from the backwoods of Vermont, huh? But I asked him, right, he was here this summer, and I said, Glenn, did that work for you to always have 3 sources backing up every single thing you wrote down? He said, absolutely. 1 is hopeless, 2 is okay, but 3, you're all set. And so I tried that with the colonel, as I said, but he, the man took some secrets with him. But I do, I'm grateful for the new bridge, because those of us who have been around for a long time remember that the reality of Middlebury having been a horse and buggy town and did not adopt well to the automobile in terms of just traffic patterns and so forth. So now it's much easier, and I don't miss it's amazing how one the days of getting to the high school by crossing the trestle. Oh boy. we had it right down. There was this whole little shuffle on the times, and I didn't realize until later that it's probably not a great idea. Well, we always rehearse what we do. Well, if the train comes, what are we going to do? We're going to hang from the ties? Are we going to jump in? What are we going to do? It never happened. But anyway, that and then, which is sort of too bad. My wife and I also, in terms of not only history but prehistory, there was a while there when we just went around in the old Vermont tradition to various cornfields around town, and we picked up all kinds of Native American artifacts. She actually found a canoe gouge, and drills, crazy stuff. She had a real talent for it. But so that takes me back to, again, my childhood, and these were well-meaning people. And it took me forever to figure out how this got going. I was told, again, another piece of misinformation. I was informed with a straight face that the, quote, Indians never lived in Vermont, they were just passing through. Well, even as a kid, I thought that seemed awfully unreasonable. I mean, there were people picking up arrowheads all over the place. That didn't make any sense. Well, in 1980, the first real honest-to-God scholarly book I recommended highly, The Original Vermonters by Haviland and Powell. Excellent book. And it proved conclusively that was just total hokum. So then, of course, later in my historian sleuth, I thought to myself, well, there has to be a reason for this. There has to be some foundational myth that made all this everyone, you heard it all the time. I finally figured it out. When Samuel Champlain sailed down and saw the shores of what would be like Champlain, it was dotted with abandoned villages. They were all dead because of disease. From the early part of from 1600 to 1620, saw about a 95% crash of demographics in what is now New England. So that's where that got going. Well, yeah, when he came through, there wasn't anybody here. So that meant, there wasn't, the persistence of the myth. It wasn't until 1980 when the book came out saying, that finally that got put to rest. But amazing what, and that's sort of what got me going as a teacher and a historian, because all the stuff I've been taught that was just flat out wrong. And so, okay, I had fun with it.
I always heard that the floor from upstairs was glass. Is that true?
Oh, now that I think they're come to think of it, this section, the front section here, it was these big, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Good for you, I'd forgotten that. There were these big square, I've seen them elsewhere. There must have been somebody who came through and, was selling them, but it was quite a popular, and then I mentioned the tin. If you check out Merchants Row and you go into a lot of those stores, if you look up, you'll see that there are all these fancy embossed tin ceilings. And not just there, there are several places around town. Then, of course, and I didn't throw this in either, but now we say tin cans. They're not tin at all. They've been aluminum forever. But at this point in time, they were, in fact, tin. And that's where the money that provided the library came from. Tin cans, tin ceilings, and so forth. But I was on that piece of misinformation that I was, well, it'll occur to me, but yes.
From your perspective and experience, what, if any, thoughts do you have about the changes that are anticipated here at the library? And what, if any, advice would you give to those people who will be running it going forward? Well,
to be perfectly honest, I came in, I looked at all the plans, and I got so confused that I don't really have an answer. I grew up with so much influence from the 19th century. I had a hard time with the 20th century, and I have not gotten adjusted to the 21st. Although I feel that it's almost a quarter over, that's not a very good track record. But just a little anecdote for you that I find pretty amusing. That every so often I go down to the Otter Creek Used Books, and I help my friend Barbara Harding. And I have a pretty good intuitive sense of when she really needs help. I.e., when somebody's just come in and said, so-and-so just died, I have their whole estate in books, and before she could say no, there they are, she's getting them in the door. So, oh my God, so this was just last week, I went down, and my timing was right, and I said, okay, she was just standing there. I said, all right, I can help you out. So, she trusts me, and I know what's going to sell, what isn't, and so forth. And the man was a minister, so there was a great deal of information about, there were at least 4 biographies of John Calvin, which frankly, went in the trash just as fast as I could get them there. I don't like John Calvin, it's just me. And there were a few of Luther, and there were 5 or 6 biblical concordances that were pretty serious. And on and on and on and on and on. And then piles and piles about how to preach better and pray better and so forth. So I sort of went through all this, and I said to Barbara, boy, I've got to have an awful conversation with St. Peter about this. So this is not going to make me look good. But the crowning moment of the whole thing was when, and this is obliquely answering your question, there was a book, and the title was The Death of Literacy in the Age of Spectacle. And so I turned around, and there were 4 or 5 people, and I said, look, watch this, look at this, look at this. And I took it and I threw it in the trash. I said, rear guard action. So we still have books, and I'm sure that it'll be a success. And things have to change. And from what I don't want to diss Dana here, but I know that the design is a good one, and I'm sure looking forward to it. It's going to disorient me in a bad way to try to chase the library around in the meantime. But as you have seen, it's been a lot of other places, like up and around and back in the Buttolph block and so forth. And then let me throw in another word for, I mentioned the Beckwith block. And if you ever have a chance to really look at it carefully, there it is. It's just a fantastic building. Yeah, and it's designed by Clinton Smith. And he, when I was doing research at the museum, I found he was a farm boy, like Henry Sheldon, and he was sick of being a farm boy. I can't imagine why, and decided to do something else. And so he purchased a double volume of encyclopedia of building and architecture, and the museum folks were kind enough to let me look at it. Absolutely fascinating. All the designs you can think of, the town hall, the Methodist church, the Beckwith building, and he started with Shard Villa. I don't know if anybody's been down to Shard Villa, but it's quite sort of a strange thing to find out in the backwoods of Salisbury, but there it is, a complete Italian villa, and he got it right out of that book. So I feel like, and it's so funny, I didn't know anything about him before I started researching, and he's everywhere, he's just extraordinary. And apparently, just a fine fellow, nobody ever had anything bad to say about him. He was great. If you ever find yourself out at the Foot Street Cemetery, his monument is the Grieving Angel. It's quite a handsome piece of cemetery art. He also, this is just an example of me not saying something 12 million times. All the times that I saw the front of the the town hall, it's not the town hall theater, it didn't occur to me, and then I suddenly realized, wait a minute, and I flashed back to a lecture given by Glenn Andrus, no less, at Middlebury College, and I thought, wait a minute, now I understand. The facade, as you walk up the stairs and go into the town hall theater, that marvelous arch, it's taken directly from the Alhambra Mosque in Toledo, Spain. And there it was in the book. So here I am going through the encyclopedia, and then I opened it up. What's this? It was a pencil sketch, including all the proper measurements and everything for Columbus Smith's mausoleum at Shard Villa. Pretty crazy stuff. So there are all these stories going in a number of different directions, and the reason that the family there was this strange inheritance story, the Shard family, and they claimed that they were related to the royal family of England, and that they had inheritance in England, and so a local lawyer took it upon himself to go to England and backtrack, and my golly, it was true. They were owed huge amounts of money, and so he arranged it all, came back with a big wad of capital, and said, what do you want to do? Well, we want to build something that's very distinctive. And so they hired the young Clinton Smith, and if you think, there's another piece of architecture that is quite similar, and that's the horse barn at the Oregon Horse Farm. You'll notice that they're very, very similar stylistically, and that was Clinton Smith. Clinton Smith also, you're wondering about him, he made all his own bricks down in his shop down in Frog Hollow. They had a kiln, and the marble he was a friend of Redfield Proctor, and so the marble came from Proctor, and then when Clinton Smith finally sort of there are all sorts of his house, by the way, is immediately south of the Town Hall Theater. You might want to take a close look at that sometime. It's absolutely fascinating. He built it. If you walk by at street level, you might not get it, because it's built into the side of the hill in such a way, very, very clever. And 3 porches, and it's really marvelous. In every way, every angle you look at that house from, it's different, because he has an encyclopedia, and it's known as the Queen Anne style. Well, the Queen Anne style means feel free to throw anything in you want, which is great. And if you take a look at the Methodist Church, for example, you'll discover that it has Gothic, Romanesque, and Byzantine all rolled into one. Not bad, So that was a good investment of the encyclopedia. But and I'm sure Clinton Smith actually did get the commission from Joe Battel to design the Battel block. That was his last local effort, whereupon Redfield Proctor had become a big deal in national affairs, and Clinton Smith spent the last part of his career inspecting fortifications for the U.S. government. So all these, interesting, intertwined stories. And once again, the Colonel really, I didn't know that about Calvin Coolidge until a friend of mine who's a real biography nut, and he said that was exactly at that point when Calvin Coolidge's son was quite young. I thought, his early 20s maybe?
16.
Oh, that young? Thanks, Mr. Douglas. Yeah, that's pretty brutal. And it did put a damper on his already, laconic style, shall we say. And that was a connection it sort of clicked for me. But again, the Colonel is certainly was an admirable character. But I think the more I come back to it, that moment when he didn't say when he stood up, and why he didn't say it, because in my teaching career, I've also been lucky to have 2 or 3 close friends who were, saw serious combat. At one point, my father-in-law, my first father-in-law, lived over on Court Street, and he was the head of custodial services at Middlebury College. And almost nobody knew that he had won a Silver Star in Korea at the Chosin Reservoir. Before that, he was a combat medic, but you never hear anything about it. But he was a combat medic at Normandy. I think he was 19, I think, at that point. And so he saw just horrendous stuff. And he didn't have a whole lot to say, but I learned from him and several other friends, again, in the spirit of Colonel Ilsley, that if someone who has experienced combat pays you the enormous compliment of actually telling you something, it's because you never, ever ask. It's just not done. I made a mistake as a kid once. And I asked some local veteran about, the war in the Pacific. Ooh, I realized that was not a good idea. So anyway, the point of all that is that the difference between a veteran who is telling you a genuine story and the people who are probably peeling potatoes is that the potato peelers will go on and on. And the fellows who have seen the elephant will usually be able to tell you a story in under 30 seconds that you would wish you'd never heard. And some of my students, of course, so I said, okay. I got a buddy who was a 5th Marine, 1968, Tet Offensive. And they didn't know anything about that. So I said, Vietnam. And I said, here's his story. He goes like this. Hue was full of brick walls, and we'd call up a rocket launcher and blow a hole through, and then we'd draw straws to see who'd go through first, because there wasn't anybody on the other side except North Vietnamese. End of story. Or, same guy, and they would come out of nowhere. We'd be out canoeing or something, and all of a sudden, and that was it. And so he'd say, he said, I had to carry a flamethrower that way. Somebody had to. And I'd say to my students, you want to know any more? Oh, no. So back to, so my friend, George Thomas, and relating to the Civil War. So George and I were coming back from some misbegotten adventure out west, and been, driving all night. But we were going by the battlefield of the Wilderness. And I said to George, I had a relative who disappeared at the Wilderness in 1864. And I'd like to go to the crossroads where the last thing we knew about, I beg your pardon, he was captured and went to Andersonville. The other fella, who was a Middlebury guy, Abijah Crane, and he was a correspondent, so his letters exist. And he would write, about the experiences that he had. And he disappeared in 1864 during the first day at the Wilderness. And so I said, well, George, he stopped at the museum, the visitor center, National Park Service. Great job, Wasn't anybody there, just the two of us. We walked in, and I was sort of, oh, wow, this is fascinating. And I looked into this display, and there was the uniform of a drummer boy who had probably been all of 16, maybe. And his uniform, a photograph of him, with his drum looking. And there was his uniform that had been cut off right here because he'd been hit in the thigh and bled to death, femoral artery, right? So I'm looking at this going, how about that? And all of a sudden, in the reflection of the glass, I saw my friend's face. And I thought, what am I doing? This guy has seen more mayhem than, I said, oh, geez, George, I'm sorry. I felt terrible. We got out of there. And I said, listen, we'll get out of here completely, but I have to go to the crossroads. I've got to do it. Didn't say anything. Okay. So we went to the crossroads, and we parked the car and got out. And this was one of the pivotal moments of the Civil War, when the Vermonters went up against the Texans. Well, I don't know if anybody spent any time in Texas, but actually, there's a lot more similarity between Vermont and Texas than you'd ever believe unless you lived there for a while. The same attitude toward a lot of things. And so they went, toe to toe. And all of a sudden, George is like this. Okay, yeah. So, look at this. They dug in here. And you couldn't shut him up. All of a sudden, I hadn't heard him talk that much in years. And he could see that battlefield in a way that I never could, because he'd seen the elephant, right? So the colonel, again, didn't see much point in talking about the experiences that he'd had. But he, and so again, back to that whole, and again, it's taken me a lot of time as a historian, especially to a lot of, sometimes it's therapeutic, I guess. Oftentimes, various books have been written, including some of the material for Ken Burns. He relied on Sledge and some other guys. The interesting thing about them was that their daughters invariably said, "Dad, please, please." And finally, they said, "Okay." And wrote these memories of their war experiences. Again, back to the Colonel's sword, I think that Judy discovered that he willed it to his niece or something, but again, there are all these dead ends. But anyway, that's how we happen to be sitting here in this wonderful library today on the 100th anniversary.
Thank you.